Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us today for a webinar on PFAS, slippery slope or manageable risk for property transactions and redevelopment. This is the question of the day. And many thanks to EKI for sponsoring this timely webinar. We appreciate your expertise and your willingness to help put this on. My name is Erica Rippey. I'm the program manager from the Center for Creative Land Recycling, and we are really excited to bring you guys this programming. So a little bit of housekeeping before we start. The question I get asked the most is this webinar going to be recorded? And the answer is always yes, it will be recorded and circulated in an email after the webinar. You can download the presentation slides by clicking on the handout section. We are going to hold questions until the end, but feel free to type them in as they come to you so you don't forget. And in addition, after the webinar, there will be a survey that will be circulated, and we appreciate your feedback. So please, it's not long, and just take a couple minutes to fill that out. Thank you. And a little bit about the Center for Creative Land Recycling. We are a nonprofit organization based in Oakland, California. We organize workshops and webinars like this one today. We do policy and research as well as consulting services. We are an EPA technical assistance to brownfields communities grantee for EPA regions 2, 9, and 10. So we provide free technical assistance on brownfields redevelopment projects. You can find us online at www.cclr.org. So a little bit about today's speakers. Ed Conti is the principal geologist at EKI. He has lots of experience with risk-based corrective action, brownfields redevelopment, and legal and regulatory negotiation and support. Ginny Yingling is a hydrogeologist with the Minnesota Department of Health, and she is also the co-lead of the Interstate Technology and Regulatory Council's PFAS team. Ginny has been working with PFAS since 2004. Trisha Blau is the Environmental Services Group Managing Director at Aon Risk Solutions. Trisha is our expert on environmental liability transfers and has had experience on managing multiple cleanup programs. So many thanks to the three of our speakers for taking time out of your busy days to come and educate us on PFAS. So Ed, I will let you take it away.
Okay, thank you, Erica. So PFAS, per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, are an emerging but already recognized to be very widespread problem in the United States and elsewhere. This map just kind of sets the stage. It's some good work done in collaboration with the Environmental Working Group in Northeastern University. And it's a conservative or underestimate, really. The blue are drinking water supplies that are a limited data set based only on 6 of the thousands of PFAS compounds, using reporting levels that are higher than the currently evolving health advisories, and only from a subset of water suppliers in the United States. And the red dots are a subset, mostly Department of Defense, known contamination sites. So from a redevelopment standpoint, you look at a map like this and you consider your risk management perspectives, and you think, well, maybe if I go to Montana or Nebraska, my risk is lower. But if I'm California or the East, we have a much higher level of concern. Next slide, please. So there's lots of interesting things about PFAS. It's a fascinating class of chemicals for many reasons, even to non-chemists like me. But there's lots of things we're not going to talk about today. We've really tried to narrow this down to what is of interest and relevance right now to the redevelopment community. Why is this largely unregulated class of chemicals relevant? Again, it's largely unregulated currently. We've all heard about emerging contaminants. We've been dealing with them for years. Aren't PFAS just the latest class of emerging contaminants like many others that have come before? And our answer is no. Others have said PFAS are like emerging contaminants on steroids. There are man-made chemicals that in itself raises public concern and regulatory awareness, and it gives an automatic negative perception. They're in currently and historically very widespread use. In fact, our conclusion is if you're looking at a redevelopment scenario and there's any industrial history with that redevelopment site at any time back to the 40s, then you have a concern for PFAS in your risk management decisions when you're developing your due diligence. In addition, there's been already widespread detections as marginally illustrated in the map in the last slide. Also, the levels of concern that are generating regulatory and public concern are minute. One analogy that I've heard from others is 10 parts per trillion, which is the order of magnitude that is of concern currently in currently evolving regulations. That's one drop in 40 Olympic-sized swimming pools. And that's driving the fate and transport investigations and the remedial evaluations, and therefore driving the cost. The cost of investigating a plume like that and remediating a plume like that is quite significant. The litigation is rapidly evolving. Another industry representative recently said there's 3 to 4 new lawsuits per week related to PFAS. And folks are being sued even in the absence of regulation. And lastly, the regulatory uncertainty and the evolving and conflicting science on risk is adding to the uncertainty. Next slide. So many folks are probably having lunch as we're speaking here today, and some folks in I think Iowa, Kansas, Wisconsin, in that area have probably come in out of the rain, and all of us are adding to our body burden of PFAS as we sit here listening to this. You've heard the speakers already. I'm giving this introduction. We have Ginny speaking to the regulatory landscape, followed by Trisha giving the insurance perspective, and then I'm going to summarize what we consider to be a toolbox of available considerations in risk management for PFAS. And then we have time for question and answer after that. Next slide. So just a tidbit on PFAS chemistry. They're man-made chemicals, basically chains of carbon and fluorine atoms. There's thousands of unique compounds. They have remarkable chemical properties. They're chemically stable. They're heat resistant. They're water, stain, and grease repellent. And they're evolving. The initial bad actors, if you will, PFOS and PFOA, there's a fair bit known, although still evolving on those chemicals, but there's replacement chemicals that are just beginning to be understood in terms of their environmental impact, and Gen X is one of those. Next slide. So PFAS compounds have been in use since the 1940s. They're used in primary manufacturing, secondary manufacturing, as minor contributing chemicals to industrial processes, all sorts of consumer products, more than you might even realize without looking through this list. Big source is the firefighting foams. Some of the issues associated with PFAS are toxicity and bioaccumulation. And again, the science is evolving, particularly on toxicity. Persistence in the environment, highly mobile in the environment, and they're not removed by conventional drinking water or wastewater treatment technologies, particularly wastewater at wastewater treatment plants. Next slide. This describes sort of pictorially sources and pathways, and all these different processes and products in one form or another are sources. And it's sort of like the I like to say, the fate and transport highway. The PFAS chemicals, one of the challenges is their high mobility in the environment. So whether it's air discharge, land discharge via landfills or biosolids, or stormwater discharges, or migration to groundwater, once they're in the environment, they are highly mobile in all media and have even been detected in sediments. Next slide. This illustrates a couple of the significant sources or potential sources, the use of firefighting foams and the resultant discharges to soil, groundwater, surface water via the stormwater pathway, and potentially air emissions. And similarly with industrial operations, the air discharges to wastewater treatment plants. And again, wastewater treatment plants currently are not designed to treat for PFAS. Stormwater discharges, potential on-site waste disposal practices. Next slide. This illustrates the landfills, and many consumer products obviously end up in landfills, and landfill leachate has been shown to be a PFAS source. Biosolids, again, from the wastewater treatment plants, sometimes sent to landfills, sometimes used as agricultural amendment. Stormwater runoff from all the above, and direct stormwater runoff into surface water bodies. Next slide. This is an example site. Many former airstrips have become redevelopment sites, and obviously properties near such airfields have become redevelopment sites. This is a site in Newburgh, New York, about 100 miles north of New York City. And the due diligence uncovered numerous firefighting foam locations on the property. Next slide. Essentially, the investigation identified PFAS in every media. Surface water, it's stormwater runoff directly to a drinking water supply, soil, groundwater, it's not listed here, but also sediment in a nearby drinking water supply. This has led to significant litigation. The water supplier has filed suit against 23 defendants, including owners and operators, including the landowner. And also the residents have filed class action lawsuits against the city for being the supplier of the water. And this is the source site itself. Consider a situation where we were looking at a redevelopment even near a property like this. PFAS would be a significant factor. Next slide. So moving on this presentation, we're going to talk about ways we might manage risk associated with a PFAS site, a PFAS source site, or a site potentially impacted by PFAS, critical elements of due diligence. And Ginny and Trisha are going to speak about the regulatory landscape and insurance perspectives. And then I'm going to wrap that up into a discussion of potential tools to consider in the transaction process. Next slide.
Okay, so that's me. Thanks, Ed. What I want to do is talk a little bit about what some of the state and federal approaches are to PFAS and what the ever-evolving landscape around regulation or lack thereof is looking like right now. So next slide. And Ed alluded to this before. You know, we've worked with a lot of environmental contaminants, even these persistent bioaccumulative contaminants. We've got experience dealing with those. But for some reason, the state and federal government and the public have much higher level of concern around perfluoroalkyl substances, and especially the ones that Ed helped to highlight a little bit, things like PFOA and PFOS, which we refer to as perfluoroalkyl acids. They're a subset, and they're the ones that absolutely do not degrade in the environment. So wrapping your head around the whole chemistry of these chemicals is a challenge. But when we're talking about the ones that we're really worried about right now in terms of environmental and human health effects, it's these non-degradable contaminants that have gotten into the environment. And the reason that these have raised levels of concern beyond what we've seen with other persistent bioaccumulative toxins like dioxins and PCBs is they're unique relative to those kinds of chemicals. So one of the things that's highlighted in this table is the fact that they're water soluble. Most persistent and accumulative toxins tend not to dissolve into water. So they don't tend to be something that we worry about getting very widely distributed. They tend to be more of a concern in soils on our sites, but they don't usually tend to be a groundwater issue. The other thing is that dioxins and PCBs, to a small extent at least, will degrade. But as Ed pointed out, these perfluoroalkyl acids, what we also refer to as terminal PFAS, they do not degrade. The only thing you can do, as far as we know right now, to destroy them is high temperature thermal destruction or ultrasonic destruction. As a result of the fact that they're highly water soluble and they're persistent, we've found that they bioaccumulate in fish, which is similar to what we see with dioxins and PCBs. But because they're so abundant in water, we're seeing much more of a problem for fish. They also don't tend to accumulate in lipids. So dioxins and PCBs, they sequester in our body to fats. Instead, PFAS goes to proteins. So if you click on this again, this is what really complicates our understanding of bioaccumulation and toxicity for this class of chemicals. It's why it's taking a long time for the states and federal government to be able to evaluate each of these chemicals that are in this large class, because we're still trying to understand exactly how they accumulate in our bodies and what parts of our bodies the different chemicals sequester to. And if you click again, as Ed mentioned, some of the numbers, the guidance values and regulatory values that are being developed for drinking water are in the part per trillion range, which is something new for a lot of us. But the reason for that is because they're so bioaccumulative, so that if you're drinking part per trillion levels in your water, they're accumulating to part per billion levels in our body. And that's why states are and the federal government are setting such low numbers. And as I mentioned before, drinking water is a major exposure route for these chemicals, which is, you add accumulation and the potential for it to be in drinking water, and that tells you you've got a potentially serious problem on your hands. Next slide. Ed showed a similar map. This is a map that was put together by Eurofins, Eaton Analytical, showing the results of the EPA's unregulated contaminant monitoring sampling that was done in 2013 to 2015. As Ed mentioned, they were only looking for a list of 6 of those persistent chemicals, the PFAS, and the list is shown here. And as he mentioned, although there was fairly widespread detections, 4% of the systems tested showed detections, only about 1.3% exceeded the EPA's lifetime health advisories, and those are shown with the red pins. But there were some real limitations to the studies that they did. And so it was only municipal systems that serve greater than 10,000 people, and then a selected subset of smaller systems. They were only looking for the 6 PFAS. If you click on this again, I guess I'm not quite on top of where my where my animations are, but because of the UCMR3 study, we've expanded our horizons beyond just the old industrial landfill or legacy disposal sites that were shown in the kind of pink coloring or lettering. And UCMR3 helped to identify some city water systems that were contaminated by different sources. Bemidji and Colorado Springs by AFFF sites, Hoosick Falls from an industrial site. That was secondary manufacturing use of PFAS in another manufacturing process. If you click again, here's one of the limitations to that data. They did not test for PFBA or PFPEA. And here's part of that alphabet soup that I mentioned for these chemicals. But the reason that's important, in Minnesota at least, PFBA is the chemical we find most commonly. It's the smallest of the PFAAs that we typically test for. So it's got a short chain. It's highly water soluble. It's essentially a groundwater tracer. We find it in nearly every sample we collect, at least at trace levels. So by not including that on the analytical list, it may have underreported the extent of the water contamination in the country. The other thing, and Ed mentioned this, they had relatively high reporting levels. And they only sampled at the entry points for the drinking water system. So, for example, in Bemidji, Minnesota, the first round of sampling didn't find a problem. They, if I recall correctly, they didn't even detect anything. That's because two wells out of 7 were pumping, and they're the clean wells. They came back and resampled, and 2 different wells, the ones in the plume, were pumping, and they exceeded the drinking water numbers. So it was a little bit of a luck of the draw on some of these, whether they had exceedances or detections or not. So even though it's a robust data set and it's very helpful for illustrating how widespread the problem may be, you need to take it with a little bit of a grain of salt. A green pin on this map is not an all clear. I think if you click one more time, yep. And as Ed also mentioned, we're now moving into the next phase as we're phasing out some of the longer chain chemicals and looking for replacement chemistries. We're starting to find some of those chemicals like Gen X showing up as people start testing for them. Next slide. So this image gives you a sense of the idea, or a sense of the universe of chemicals that we're talking about. So we have the whole class called PFAS. Amongst that are the perfluoroalkyl acids, or what people used to refer to as PFCs, the perfluorinated, the fully fluorinated, won't degrade in the environment chemicals. And that's where all the attention has been so far. So early on, if you click on this, we started looking at PFOS and PFOA. That's primarily because those were the chemicals being used primarily in those large industrial manufacturing settings, like production of Teflon, production of Scotchgard and Gore-Tex. So they kind of came to the fore quickly. They were also the first ones being found in the environment. So the federal government started setting values for those. And so far, the only values we have, and they're not enforceable values, are for PFOS and PFOA. Meanwhile, the states, click again, have started setting values for some of the other perfluoroalkyl acids, because we have an analyte list that encompasses most of what you see in the yellow, orange, and pink here. And as states are finding these other chemicals, they're setting values for them because they have to respond to the fact that these chemicals are showing up in people's drinking water and in their bodies. If you click again, so the chemicals that are showing up in the lower part of that triangle in purple or pink, our site investigations are finding them, but we don't even have enough toxicological information yet to even set values for. So expect to see a continuation as more information and more studies are done. States will start setting values for some of these other chemicals as well. Meanwhile, click again. Our good friends at the universities and out in the research labs and even some of the commercial labs have been developing additional analytical technologies or techniques that allow us to find these other chemicals referred to as polyfluorinated compounds. These are the ones that are not fully fluorinated, so that carbon chain that Ed mentioned is susceptible to biodegradation or chemical degradation, and when they break down, some of them can create these perfluorinated compounds, the perfluoroalkyl acids, the ones that don't degrade in the environment. So now we're finding at sites, especially some of the firefighting sites, that the bulk of the contamination is actually in these polyfluorinated compounds or precursor compounds. They often get retained up in the soils and slowly release PFAAs over time. So it's a very complicated situation, and we're still just as this image shows, we're still working at the tip of the iceberg trying to even define the extent of the problem. Next slide. A lot of what is happening is being driven by the target analyte lists that are used. And so this image, the chemicals that are highlighted in blue are the ones that are included in the current EPA analytical method 537. You'll notice that a lot of the ones that are shown in yellow, those are some of those persistent non-degradable PFAS, including some that we find very routinely in the environment, like PFBA. Those that are shown in yellow are not on the current analyte list. Now, a lot of labs include them, but they're not on the standard EPA method. EPA intends to add them to their method. They're currently in the process of expanding their method, and they're validating that right now. So expect to see that come online either later this year or sometime next year. The ones that are highlighted in pink are some of those precursor compounds that I mentioned, the ones that can break down to the persistent perfluoroalkyl acids. And so, again, those are not on the current list. They're in the process of adding those to the list. So as we expand our analyte list, you're going to see a moving target for state and federal regulation. Next slide. This just gives you a quick overview of the few federal standards and guidelines that are available right now. As I mentioned, we've got lifetime health advisories for PFOS and PFOA only. That's 70 parts per trillion or 0.07 parts per billion. Those are not enforceable. EPA does recommend adding them together. So if you had 35 parts per trillion of each and you add them together, that hits 70 parts per trillion, so that's considered an exceedance. Most states have adopted those values for their drinking water, but as I mentioned, they're not enforceable, so that leaves people in something of a limbo. There's also some regional screening levels to try and develop guidelines for cleanups related to goals for drinking water, surface water or soil, and the soil numbers are based on either trying to protect groundwater from the contaminants leaching or for direct human contact. So you can see that the concentrations allowed for direct human health based on direct skin contact are much higher. That's not really the exposure route we're concerned about. It really is drinking water. Next slide. In the absence of guidance from the adults, the children have gone crazy. And so if you look across the different states, you are going to find that every state is dealing with PFAS in a slightly different way. Some states have buried their heads and said, we're not even going to look at this until we get clear direction from the feds. And even the lifetime health advisories, we're not using them until they're enforceable standards. Most states, I would say, I think it's around 20 or so, have adopted the EPA lifetime health advisories. Other states have set lower values, including Minnesota, New Jersey, and Vermont. And again, this is being driven largely by what they're finding at their site, which is driven by what's on their target analyte list. Some states are also looking at these chemicals as mixtures because they almost always occur as mixtures. And so some states like mine do a TEQ process like we would do with dioxins, where we look at the relative toxicity of each chemical and use that in evaluating it, sort of grading on a curve or weighting the results. Other states just do a straight addition of the total PFAS that they're detecting. And only one state has a value set for Gen X, but expect that that's going to change in the future. And then states are taking a whole slew of regulatory approaches to try and stop further releases of these chemicals into the environment and get kind of a handle on trying to not have any more emissions to our surface water or groundwater. Next slide. So how to stay on top of all of that? Well, we're attempting to do that at ITRC. We have an online spreadsheet of guidance values. We thought we could get by with just updating this annually. Then we were told, no, do it every 6 months. Then we were told that wasn't good enough. We'd have to do it quarterly. Now we're trying to do it every 4 to 6 weeks, where we query the states and add new guidance values as they emerge. And so this table just gives you a quick overview of the latest version of that spreadsheet. And you can see not only the variation in the values being used for PFOS and PFOA, but also the number of different values that have been developed across the country for different PFAAs. Also in the column where it says promulgated rule, yes, no, or other, you can see that very few of these have actually gone through rulemaking. So that complicates how they're actually being applied and the whole legal framework, which we'll get in, Trish will get into in a minute. And the other is there because it's sometimes very hard to understand exactly how some of these guidance values are being applied. So it really points to the fact that whatever state you're working in, you need to be in touch with the regulatory agencies to be clear on what guidance values they have, how they're actually applying them, and what the forecast is for changes to those values in the future. Next slide. This is a similar table for soil guidance values. We are not updating this as rapidly because the numbers there are not changing as quickly, but you can see there's also a number of values available for soil that may help to guide you in terms of site evaluation and cleanup. Next slide. So why are some states setting such different and frankly very low values? And it again goes back to the fact that these longer chain PFAAs are highly bioaccumulative. So a part per trillion in your drinking water can mean a part per billion in your body, and ongoing exposures means long-term accumulation in the body and then eventually a leveling off. But the real concern is for developing fetuses and infants because of the high intake rate of water for infants and for the high level of exposure that babies whose mothers are drinking contaminated water, the high level of exposure that they are born with. So they're born with a body burden of PFAS. And then that first year of life, especially for breastfed infants, the concentrations of PFOS and PFOA and other PFAS that are passed on through the breast milk to the babies can result in unacceptably high levels of those chemicals in the baby's body. And so that's really what is driving all these new guidance values to such low levels. Next slide. All of this adds up to a lot of regulatory uncertainty, as Ed mentioned. We're still trying to identify where all the sources are of PFAS. And while that's happening, new types of PFAS are being generated to try and get to environmentally less toxic forms of these chemicals. Cleanup goals are are shifting all over the place, largely because we have little or no information about the fate and transport of many of the PFAS. PFAS, PFOA, some of the others, we're starting to get a good handle on that, but a lot of them we just don't understand yet. There's uncertainty regarding toxicity for most of the PFAS, but as you can see, there's high levels of concern, both at the governmental and in the public levels. And then there's still disagreement about what are the objectives for cleanup goals. Are we trying to protect groundwater, surface water, fish, and not necessarily to protect the fish, but for human consumption of fish who have accumulated these chemicals? So a lot of questions still out there on that regard. And then finally, we've got precursors that we mostly have not been testing for that may constitute the majority of the contaminants or the PFAS at our sites. And we have very little or no information about their transformation products. The researchers are still trying to figure out what breaks down to what and by what pathway. And even worse, we don't have a good handle on how fast does that occur and under what conditions. Finally, as Ed's going to wrap up with all of this, the analytical methods and the remedial technologies are still emerging. We're still trying to figure out how to test for these chemicals and treat for them. Most of the new technologies are as yet unproven. They're at the bench scale or pilot scale. All of that adds up to the state and federal regulators taking very conservative approaches to sites that are contaminated with these chemicals because there's so many unknowns. We're just going to be a lot more conservative about how we deal with them. Next slide. There are efforts trying to bring some order from all this chaos. EPA held a summit earlier this year. The 4 goals that came out of that summit were to initiate steps to evaluate the need for a maximum contaminant level. So that's for public drinking water supplies, just for PFOS and PFOA. And note that this is not saying they're going to set those numbers. They're going to talk about whether they need to do that. So I would not hold my breath on seeing MCLs anytime soon. We may get some read from EPA later this year, but there's already sort of rumors floating that they may not move forward with MCLs. They are looking at whether to propose hazardous substance designation for PFOS and PFOA under CERCLA. And that's important because that allows for the states and federal government to do cost recovery on sites, especially where there might not be it allows them to do cost recovery on sites if a responsible party is not willing to take action. The other thing is it helps to free the hands of the Department of Defense, different sectors of Department of Defense, to pursue site cleanups. Right now, they're somewhat hamstrung, except for sites where there's off-site contamination and especially if there's drinking water impacts. But otherwise, they're feeling a bit hamstrung because of the lack of this hazardous substance designation to be able to actually do remediation on their sites. We do expect to see some groundwater cleanup recommendations from EPA this fall, and we do expect sometime later this year or early next year to see some toxicity values for Gen X and PFBS, so some steps forward. Meanwhile, Department of Defense is sinking tens of millions of dollars into research, and you can track that on their website. And ITRC and other nonprofit organizations are trying to act as clearinghouses for information and training and getting everybody sort of on the same page about what's the state of the science. So you can find fact sheets that help get you up to speed on different aspects of these chemicals on our website at ITRC. And I think that's my last slide. Oh, nope. So, sorry. On the horizon, there are these other analyte lists coming online, and also new analytical techniques like the top assay, QTOF, PIGGY. It's a ion method to find out total fluorine. These are going to help us find more PFAS, but then the question is, what do we do about it? EPA is planning to try and do PFAS toxicity evaluations as groups rather than going one chemical at a time, which is an extremely slow process, but we're not really clear on how that's going to work and what we're going to end up with. So that's stay tuned. They've just been querying the states on nominating their top 10 wish list for that process. In the meantime, we're left with all these questions. Do we expand our analyte list and look for more PFAS that we don't have toxicity data or guidance values for? And then how do we communicate the risk? And what do we say about cleanup? How do we establish cleanup goals in the absence of good human and ecological tox data? And what if we don't, and we set up cleanup goals that miss something, and then we have to go back and retest and reopen sites? So a lot of questions still out there on the horizon for us. Next slide.
Well, thanks, Jenny. Now we will talk about insurance. And if you can go to the next slide, Erica. So there was a bit of a spoiler already from both Jenny and Ed's presentation, and I'm sure that many of you have already thought, well, if the regulatory environment is as uncertain as it is, the insurance market is sure to be as uncertain, and I would say that that is currently the case. We're going to talk a little bit today about just a quick overview on the primary environmental insurance products you might be utilizing as a tool for a transaction or redevelopment, some of the options, and then some specific detail on current underwriting requirements when there may be a PFAS exposure. But I will caution you that the things we talk about today are going to be evolving as rapidly as the regulatory environment. So if you're looking at utilizing environmental insurance as a tool for your transaction, I do encourage you to involve your insurance professional early and discuss changes that may be going on in the marketplace as your deal develops. Next slide, please. So just a real quick overview on the primary products that we would be talking about for a transaction or a redevelopment. And obviously there are other environmental insurance products that aren't included here on this list that might be utilized, but these are the primary ones. Most commonly, you're going to be looking at what you would know as a pollution legal liability or a site pollution legal liability policy. And this is the most common product that's going to be utilized for a transaction, a merger and acquisition, a redevelopment type risk. However, there are some others that you might be considering, including a combined general liability and pollution policy that includes product liability. I would say that right now in the current environment, this is probably the product getting the most attention from, or one of the products getting most attention from the insurance marketplace, as they are providing product pollution liability on these policies. And as we have just heard, you know, the products that are causing the issues are being scrutinized now by the insurance marketplace, and some changes are happening here, including either a restriction in providing product pollution for a high exposure class, or perhaps a restriction on claims made coverage versus an occurrence-based coverage on this. And then also the contractor's pollution liability that you might be utilizing with your site liability policy to provide some construction pollution risk. Next slide, please. So just in a general, just for general discussion, there are several types of environmental risk and transaction risk that are included within policies. And primarily what we're looking at is this first bullet, which is the transactional risk. And this is the risks that are going to be associated with a deal, either an acquisition of a company, acquisition of a property, or redevelopment. And generally these are arising out of pre-existing conditions, whether known or unknown, that are in the soil and groundwater, and they're unrelated to the current or planned operations of the purchaser. Often these will involve some type of allocation of risk between the parties in the deal, generally are not going to be able to be controlled by typical risk management, and may or may not be addressed by a reps and warranties policy that's purchased as part of the acquisition. Other things such as passive risk is generally something that's not going to be insurable, and operational risk, and this is where the transaction and the operational risk combine to bring in your PFAS exposure, are risks that are associated with the operations and activities of an organization that could result in an environmental release, or perhaps already has, in why you're addressing your pre-existing condition exposure. Next slide, please. So environmental insurance can be a tool that is used in conjunction with other traditional deal tools in a transaction. So, you know, I caution people from thinking that environmental insurance in and of itself is going to be the sole solution for the environmental risk that you may be taking on as part of an acquisition or redevelopment. However, it is an extremely malleable tool that can be utilized to wrap around either other indemnities that are coming with the deal or other contractual obligations for cleanup or otherwise. And it may mitigate other deal issues such as having to set up an environmental escrow account, accepting a purchase price reduction if you happen to be the seller. So it is a piece of the puzzle that should be considered in situations where you do have of an environmental exposure for your redevelopment. Next slide, please. So we don't really have time today to go through all of the detail on exactly what a site pollution legal liability policy can do. So we have this little cartoon to just sort of quickly go through kind of the basics around what this policy is. And again, the site pollution legal liability policy, or pollution legal liability policy, is the one that is typically utilized when we're talking about wrapping around a pre-existing known or unknown pollution condition. The policy is fairly broad in its definition of pollutant or pollution condition, and it does provide, depending on the due diligence data that is collected and disclosed, on-site cleanup costs for, as well as on-site third-party bodily injury and property damage that are on, under, migrating from or to your covered location, the off-site cleanup costs, bodily injury and property damage, and also transportation and off-site disposal liability of materials that might leave the location either during your redevelopment process and potentially, depending on the underwriting, disposal that may have occurred prior to your ownership. The policy is both forward and backward looking. So at inception, you're generally going to have coverage for things that are unknown and pre-existing, as well as things that might occur post-policy binding, so new pollution conditions. And one point on this unknown and pre-existing pollution conditions coverage is that variable in the extent of coverage that is offered. So while you may have a cleanup liability that is not insurable, the third-party bodily injury and third-party property damage coverages are generally still offered. Next slide, please. So as we're getting into some specifics on how this tool is being evaluated within the environmental insurance marketplace, the site pollution liability policy is going to be purchased for a specific covered location that you are going to be redeveloping or that is part of your transaction. It can be used for operational exposure, but our topic today is really focused on transaction redevelopment. And to point out, these policies do have multi-year terms, so they're not an annual policy. When you put this in place, it really is underwritten around the transaction. Your coverage can be up to 10 years. More typically these days, we're seeing 5 to 7 year policy terms. And currently, there is no standard policy form PFAS exclusion. So underwriters at this point are underwriting each exposure on its own basis. So you should consult with your counsel regarding specific due diligence for higher risk transactions. But where we're seeing concern from the marketplace right now are current or former uses that involved PFAS, which might include a major fire where firefighting foam was used, known regional concerns like you saw from Ed's and Jenny's maps earlier. If you have proximity to a military base or you are redeveloping a closed DoD facility, as well as facilities that either utilized a precursor or utilized PFAS in their manufacturing facilities. And your due diligence might include some limited product reviewing of MSDS sheets, and as well as the disposal practices, because landfills and impoundments are obviously a large exposure position for this material. And it may require soil or groundwater sampling. But again, this is something that needs to be discussed prior with your counsel and insurance professional before committing to something as invasive as a phase 2. Next slide, please. So if you are going to redevelop or you're as part of your property transaction, you have one of these higher exposure sites, you should consider whether doing PFAS due diligence is something that may help your deal to move forward. So note that right now there is no requirement to include this as part of a phase one, but we have seen recently some discussion as to whether this should be something that is part of the other environmental considerations part of a phase one report. So it's just something to keep in mind as you're looking at a site that might be of a higher exposure. Next slide, please. So if you are looking at environmental insurance as a tool for a PFAS exposure on your redevelopment property, what's going to be required for underwriting? So you're going to have to provide all the typical things that you generally would have to for any site pollution underwriting, including your scheduled locations, the occupancy, the description of your operation, all environmental reports, claims and litigation history, as well as your redevelopment plans if that's part of your transaction. Now, what happens if PFAS is suspected or known at the property? Well, for some insurers, any detection is a deal killer. And, as you've seen from Jenny's presentation, we really don't have a good regulatory environment around this compound. So you may see, in some cases, a full exclusion for the compound. Many other underwriters are basing their decision based on local regulatory environment, accepted local threshold, health advisories, and there's some coverage available. Some other things to keep in mind is if there's a responsible party that's already on the hook, there's an indemnification, there's some other contractual obligation, underwriters can often craft coverage around some agreements or indemnities that are in place or will be put in place as part of your purchase and sale agreement. And lastly, this is a very interesting piece of the puzzle, historical insurance archaeology. So I have received an email yesterday, actually from Risk and Insurance Magazine, asking if PFAS was the new asbestos. And so many of you that may have dealt with asbestos liability in the past know that there is potentially some coverage under older general liability insurance policies prior to the pollution exclusion. And so performing some historical insurance archaeology is perhaps something that you may want to do if you are acquiring a company that had some operational exposure. Next slide. So quickly, in summary, so we can move on to your questions. There is currently no standard exclusion in site pollution policies for redevelopment. Insurers are underwriting to the risk. You're going to see more restrictions on combined general liability and pollution policies, particularly due to the product pollution liability coverage that's offered there. We are starting to see a few restrictions for operational risks at renewals, things like airports, landfills, public entities, and certain manufacturing operations. And again, talking with some of my general liability and casualty colleagues, they're looking at this as a potential exclusion similar to asbestos and silica on the general liability policies that you may want to consider. Next slide.
Okay, so what to do? Deals must go on, right? So we've tried to think about all these things and these uncertainties and put together a list of approaches and to consider, tools to consider. None of these are a single silver bullet. They're tools to be considered in conjunction with your own experience with transactions and the legal structure of a deal, and ultimately your own understanding of risk tolerance. And all this uncertainty really adds to the need to understand risk tolerance. And at the end of the day, one of the messages is going to be if PFAS is going to be considered in due diligence, then there's an added complexity and cost to the due diligence. Next slide. So first, deal structure. We are not here to give legal advice. None of us are attorneys, but our advice is make sure that there's appropriate in-house and or outside counsel involved in the environmental aspects of these transactions. If PFAS is something that you want to know about. So seller indemnity, obviously, if there's an appropriate indemnity that is robust enough, that can lower risk. But as many of you know better than us, the definition of pre-existing conditions in many purchase and sale agreements is limited to currently regulated hazardous substances. And what we're talking about today is essentially unregulated substances, many of which have not even been designated as hazardous. An as-is sale, even the importance of thorough due diligence is even more important. As I mentioned earlier, almost any historic industrial use has been shown to be a potential PFAS source. And I will say that as we consider these tools, given the uncertainty, it's a totally legitimate question to ask whether you really want to know and what happens if you find out the answer is yes, we have PFAS. What do you do then? So that is a legitimate question to consider early in the deal. Next slide. Incorporating PFAS into the due diligence. That's going to add complexity to the due diligence, especially for sites that have an industrial history or are anywhere near sites with an industrial history. Is it a potential source site, or is it a potentially impacted site? And recognize that we often start with looking at prior due diligence, prior phase ones, for example. Well, those aren't going to address PFAS. One of the first things we do is order the government database listings, the hundreds of pages of information that's already known. PFAS is not going to be in those yet. So these are real complexities that add to the added level of effort and cost associated with due diligence. Next slide. So this is a really interesting piece of work just published by the Brown School of Engineering. If everyone wants the reference, just let us know, we'll send it to you. But they're looking at all sorts of sites and basically modeling the risk. And this can be used, of course, if you're looking at redevelopment of a site that has this in its history, or as Jenny said, something near, or Trish said, something near one of these sites. Again, thinking back to the Phaeton Transport Highway, we're finding that PFAS are so mobile that there is significant impact along the Phaeton Transport Pathway from many of the source sites. And we're seeing in the legal landscape, we're seeing lawsuits that are against property owners. We're seeing lawsuits that include diminished property value, all the things that are of concern when acquiring and redeveloping pieces of property. Next slide. So if you want to know, if you answer that question early on in the transaction that you do want to know whether you've got impact from PFAS, it leads to a phase 2 investigation with all sorts of challenges that Ginny in particular has highlighted. One is, will the seller allow testing? Because if the deal doesn't go through, do they want to know? Second, which PFAS to test for and how much money do you want to spend doing that, especially if you want to investigate the PFAS target analytes that are still in the research and development phase on the amongst the analytical laboratories. Are there approved methods, and what happens in court if you're using unapproved methods? And then there are numerous challenges with the sampling itself. Next slide. PFAS are ubiquitous. We've already, I think, made that point, but PFAS are in lots of our typical sampling equipment. They're in lots of the laboratory equipment. They're in the paper products we use in the field and the containers we use to contain our samples. They're in our clothing and our sunscreen that we put on. So the field aspects require significant extra care. Laboratory equipment can be a source of PFAS. PFAS can absorb to laboratory equipment and therefore reduce the analytical results. And all this is still being evaluated and understood, and the actual influence of these sources is unclear. New York State recently released a guidance that is kind of interesting to read. It basically prohibits the sampler from wearing new clothes because clothes have to be washed, must be washed is the language of the guidance, multiple times before used in the field for sampling. And what does that do? Of course, as we've already talked about, that takes the PFAS on all of our clothing and puts it into the laundry water, which then goes to the wastewater treatment plant, which doesn't get treated in the wastewater treatment plant, and then is discharged to land and surface water bodies. So it's all a bit of a puzzle at the moment, but let's continue with the tools that we do have to keep working on the risk. Next slide. Yes, thank you. Again, this is more legal, and throughout all of this, one of the tools is consult with appropriate counsel, in-house, outside counsel, as appropriate. But evaluating potential for liability within a transaction is an important step. It's a step you all know about because it's been around for a while, but how does it apply to PFAS? It's not a circular hazardous, PFAS are not circular hazardous substances. As Ginny said, that's being evaluated. New York has taken some action to call them certain PFAS hazardous. States have their own liability protections. For example, the California Land Reuse and Revitalization Act. Different states call them different things, comfort letters, covenants not to sue, etc. How do they apply to PFAS? That, with input from counsel, would have to be looked at in each individual case. And many of these protections don't apply to third-party claims. And it's important to recognize that even if a substance is unregulated, and this has already happened, you can still be sued if PFAS allegedly are migrating from your property, regulated or not. Next slide. Assess the regulatory landscape. Given the time, I'm going to skip over this because I think Ginny has done a good job in that. Next slide. Same with this. I think Trisha has done an excellent job of explaining the uncertainty in the insurance world right now. Next slide. And remediation. So that's one of our tools also. But what do we remediate to? How conservative do you want to be? These are considerations. You've already heard about the varying and evolving guidance. Dig and haul is still a practical approach for redevelopment to take it to a landfill. New technologies are being developed, worked on by academia, government, and industry quite significantly right now. But at the end of the day, decisions have to be made in the deal. Do we want to, A, do we want to know, B, do we want to be forward-looking and try to be extra conservative in our remedial approach for constituents that don't have levels yet? Or do you remediate just to whatever the local, I should say state regulatory regime at the moment is focused on? Next slide. So just to sum up then, these are the tools that we listed and went through. And I'll just repeat that there's not a single silver bullet. And at the end of the day, PFAS, because of the uncertainty, is significantly adding to the potential risk associated with a transaction where PFAS may be involved. And understanding risk tolerance, I think, is a critical factor that'll then inform how to use the rest of these tools. Next.
All right. Well, thank you go ahead, Ed.
No, I was just going to say on to you, Erica.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Ed, Ginny, and Trisha for thoroughly unsettling probably everyone who's been on this webinar. And really quickly, I just want to plug some of CCLEAR's upcoming events where EKI will be available at. And at the California Land Recycling Conference, which is happening in Carson, California on October 24th. Registration closes next Friday. And please visit CCLEAR's website to see some of our upcoming workshops. And so type in your questions, everybody, and we can go through them. I know we have about 10 minutes, and we want to let you all go to lunch or, get back to work. So we've gotten quite a few questions, so let me go through these. And either Ginny or Ed, I have a question for you from Linda. What were the disposal technologies? Won't high temperature incinerators reject burning PFAS waste because of the high fluorine, which impacts the scrubbers?
So I don't think we can say definitively that it would be rejected, but the answer certainly is that they would have to evaluate that. I've not seen incineration being used yet as a treatment technology, so I don't have a case history I can refer to on that.
Yeah, this is Jenny. I know the Department of Defense has used incineration in some cases for getting rid of stockpiles of their their longer chain AFFF. So, but I'm not familiar with whether or not which incinerators are accepting it and which aren't. So it's certainly something to consider. I know sorry, go ahead.
I can also add that there have been cases. Right now, the only thing that really works in water and it doesn't work that well, but for some PFAS compounds, activated carbon is the go-to treatment technology, and they are incinerating spent activated carbon. I can't tell you which incinerators, but this has been addressed in the context of remediation in terms of incineration of spent activated carbon.
Right. The other technology for drinking water is ion exchange resins, where you end up with a concentrated brine that often then they try to absorb it onto some material and again send it off for incineration. And that's been largely the technology used in Australia. I expect to see it become more common in the US because it removes some of those shorter chain PFAS. So, but I agree. I think, there's definitely some incinerators taking the stuff, but I don't know which ones.
Okay, next question. So how do sampling protocols for PFAS add to a phase 2? This is Ignacio's question.
So I'll take that one. So I summarized that a little bit in one of the slides. The extra care has to be taken with all the preparation steps, with the equipment used in the field, and with the decisions regarding analytical protocols. That can take a fair bit of extra time to sort out what the parties want to see at the end of it. And in terms of sampling equipment, even the decontamination water that's used in the field has to be certified PFAS-free. Some investigations you can just go to the mini mart and buy deionized water or distilled water, but in this case, we use water provided by the laboratory that's already been tested and certified to be PFAS-free. So there's numerous steps that are additional steps and level that address the level of care for phase 2 investigation.
I'll just add to that too, though. There's a certain amount of urban myth or urban legend going on with some of the analytic or the sampling protocols. A lot of this is not proven yet. And so especially the Department of Defense is investing money in evaluating some of the sampling protocols because they've already demonstrated that a lot of the personal care products like sunblock and insect repellent actually don't have PFAS in them. And our own experience is that you really don't get much interference or sample contamination from Teflon components. So I think we're still learning what we really need to do out of the currently pretty conservative sampling protocols.
Yeah, I would agree with that. It's sort of the challenge of how conservative do you need to be, and one of the things that is part of these phase 2 that is more important than some others is field blanks and equipment blanks.
Absolutely.
Because of this uncertainty, it's really important to be able to just demonstrate that it ideally wasn't a factor.
Great. So a question from Dan, could you clarify the risk equation that you presented? Specifically, how do you get to risk level using no years in operation? Yeah, that was worded a little weirdly, but yeah.
Well, let me say first that I believe you said it was Dan asking that question. Dan, send us a message so we can send you the paper. It's a very recent publication, but if I understood the question, zero operation is zero risk because it's basically in a model. It's kind of the 0 point. You can't have any risk if it never operated. But again, that's a modeling answer. And so it may not be the best example of how to use the model. And again,
okay, yeah.
remember, it's only a model. So this is just a generalized way to help in evaluating the magnitude of risk that then plays into the whole transaction.
All right. And then another question from Adam. We have time for maybe 2 more, and then after this presentation concludes, if you've asked a question, we will forward it on to the speakers so that you guys can get an answer. So Adam, this is your question. In your estimation, is it difficult to find a commercial lab capable of analyzing water samples for PFAS? And if capable, can they report down to the parts per trillion level?
I think increasingly you can find commercial labs that are able to do that. You'll want to check, as I think Ed mentioned, you want to check with the state or local regulators to be sure that they're running a method that is consistent with what they require. But a lot of commercial labs are starting to pick up PFAS as one of their analytical methods, and they are getting down to part per trillion levels. Even into part per quadrillion, God help us. And so the costs are going down, and more labs are becoming available.
So I'll add to that as well. One key point is the labs are developing their own methods because other than the drinking water method, US EPA 527, there aren't methods for the other media. And so when you use a specific lab, they'll say modified 527, for example, but they develop their own modifications. And what we've seen is significant variability amongst the labs and no certified methods either at the federal or state levels. So it is important to, as Jenny just said, and it's one of our tools here, is to consider the local, i.e. state regulatory landscape and consider what your state regulators are using, and so that you either can use similar labs or similar methodologies. And then there's another approach related, and that is that the DoD has been vetting laboratories, and there are certain labs that have kind of passed the DoD certification program for PFAS, and that's probably the most robust thing we have right now in the absence of US EPA methods. So those labs are available too.
Okay. And then second to last question, regarding the resources that are available to people. Other than the ITRC fact sheet tables, are there any other compilation of state-by-state guidance and criteria? So are there any documents that are available where all this information is in one place?
The National Groundwater Association just published a fairly large document. I think it was last year that they published. And I don't know if they have a compilation of state regulations. And EPA may be trying to keep track of what the states are doing. I just don't know. But it's a kind of a daunting task, so I don't know that too many people are trying to do it. But the ITRC website is free access for the documents and those spreadsheets. So,
all right. And since it is 12:15, one final question to all of the speakers. So, are PFAS impacted properties a slippery slope or a manageable risk? What do you think?
I think I love that question. Thank you for asking, whoever that was. I was thinking about that actually in myself just yesterday, and I think it depends. I think it can be a slippery slope if you choose to find out and are not prepared to deal with the consequences. Alternatively, it can be a slippery slope if a transaction goes through and the issue comes up later. I think I didn't mention it, but we had on one of our slides that New York, I may have mentioned it, but New York has just recently issued a directive to go back to sites that have already been approved. The remediation's already been approved. They're actually even looking at sites that have certificates of completion, and they're going back and requiring PFAS analysis. So some of these are brownfield sites that have been through the program, already have approved remedial action implementation plans, and now they're going back to look at PFAS. So all that being said, when you look at all the different options that we laid out today, and if one understands their risk tolerance, I think we're of the sense that it is a manageable risk. But you might want insurance to back yourself up if you can get it.
And I would say, there's some new technologies that have come online for stabilizing the contaminants on site, and that may be one approach for dealing with these things if they are on a property, is to stabilize the situation so that you're not creating a release offsite, and then allow the regulatory framework to settle into place a little bit more. So that's one approach that I've heard a lot of people talking about, is using things like modified carbon that you mix with the soil to keep the stuff on site, or colloidal carbon that you inject into the aquifer to keep the groundwater from the contaminants from migrating off site with the groundwater. And then hope that they should be good for at least some period of time, and that would give time for the regulations and the guidances to start falling into place.
And I would agree. I think Ed has summed it up very well, that you should know what you don't know and decide how much of that risk you're willing to take, and how much time and effort and knowledge you can put forth to provide some certainty around what it is your transaction or your redevelopment might look like 3-4 years from now.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody, for hanging on a few minutes later. And thanks again, Ed, Ginny, and Trisha. We really appreciate your expertise and an answer to the question of the day. If you guys have questions, the contact information for our speakers is up here. And we look forward to seeing you again at our next webinar. Have a good rest of the day, everybody.